Greetings everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Making of Contemporary India, the Colonial Legacy. The history of India's past has been the period of the British rule of nearly around 200 years from 1757 to 1947. So this period has been described as the period of colonial rule. Until 1500 to 1600, we see that world over cotton and textiles had always been produced locally. However, things began to change with the great discoveries and the military expansion of Europe. The West appropriated land in America, sent slaves from Africa in order to produce raw cotton, and finally banned Indian textiles from 1800 to 1850. So Europe was able to gradually take control of global textile manufacturing, and this also impacted the market in India. A very important role in this entire process was played by slavery. Half of the slaves transported over between 1492 to 1888 were transported after 1780, and especially from 1780 to 1820. So there was huge acceleration of the slavery system during this period, as has been pointed out by P. Parthasarathi in his famous work, Why Europe Grew Rich and Asia Did Not. The key role of British banning Indian textiles and also capturing the world manufacturing output by 1800 was instrumental in giving a particular shape to Indian economy. So then we can now discuss the second important phase of colonial economy in India, that is the free trade phase, ranging from 1813 to 1860. This phase again was largely geared towards meeting the needs of British economy, especially British industry, because industrial revolution had now come of age. So there was now more and more focus on importing cheap raw material that was made readily available in colonies like India through a policy of commercialization of agriculture. So taking the raw material and giving cheap machine made goods, particularly textiles, became the core policy of Britishers in India. Indian products had to now compete with British machine made products that were mass produced, and this entirely became a one-way free trade, because Indian products, while they could not enter freely in European markets due to tariff policy, while the British manufactured goods could easily find their way into India as no duty was applicable on them. So what was the impact on Indian economy as a result of this free trade policy? One was, of course, destruction of Indian textile industry, which has also been described as deindustrialization, loss of employment opportunities, declining incomes, especially of the artisans. Most of them were losing their jobs, and no alternative employment being made available to them. Then there were several other activities also and policies that were being implemented. For example, development of transportation, railways, roads, but all this also was largely geared to boost the access of raw material, the easy and cheap availability of raw material, so that through railways and a network of roads, Britishers could access the remotest corners and make their goods available, as well as extract cheap raw materials from the interiors. And also important was the commercialization of agriculture, which boosted the growth and cultivation of cash crops, which were much in demand in European economy, especially British industries. So there were several restrictions that were placed on Indian production. Indians were forced to buy British goods. No competition was allowed during the free trade policy phase, and cheap clothes that were coming from from England, easily drove out local producers. While a railway network was fast expanding, at the same time, this resulted in easy transportation of plantation crops like tea, indigo, coffee, cotton, jute, and opium. Opium was shipped to China in exchange for tea, and tea was then sent to England, where it was much in demand, especially after Industrial Revolution. Now we come to the third and the final phase, that is finance imperialism from 1858 to 1947. The theory of finance imperialism, according to the common interpretations of Hobson and Lenin, this basically indicates that investments in formal empires should yield higher returns than investments in the imperial metropolis and foreign countries. So the underlying idea was that lot of surplus capital was being generated in Europe, especially in Britain, as a result of Industrial Revolution. There was a limit, however, to which this money could have been reinvested. The capital could have been reinvested in Britain also, but then there was a limit to that investment. Firstly. Secondly, the labor policies in European countries had become more and more sterner. So therefore, there was a limit to exploitation. Therefore, it was not as profitable to invest further in the home country. Whereas in the colonial countries, if such investments were made, firstly, they would bring a guaranteed rate of interests. Secondly, there was no limit to exploitation, and thirdly, profit would have been much higher if investments were made in the colonial countries. So therefore started the phase of economic imperialism in British India, where there was lot of focus on investment of British capital. So therefore, when railways were started in India, though it was declared as a project to develop India, but ultimately the ulterior motive was to facilitate investment of British capital. So finance capitalism became the new mode of exploitation, and investment was in the form of loans by British government on behalf of Indian government. For example, in railways, ports, irrigation projects, etc. Now, what was the impact of all these colonial policies on industry? One was, of course, deindustrialization, where the already flourishing handicrafts and handloom sector of India gradually was getting depleted. And then there was also some kind of development of industries like mining, iron and steel, shipping, railways, and later on the fiscal system, banking, etc. And as a result of these changes, several factory acts also had to be brought in from 1894 to 1942. Major changes took place in the world economy after 1860. Industrialization had spread to several countries of Europe, US and Japan, with the result that Britain's industrial supremacy in the world came to an end, and this was a huge setback for Britain. So she exchanged the informal empire over most of the underdeveloped world for the formal empire of a quarter of it, plus the older satellite economies. The application of scientific knowledge to industries led to an intensification of industrialization. Modern chemical industries, use of petroleum as fuel for the internal combustion engine, and the use of electricity for industrial purposes further developed during this period. But there was a unification of world market because of this revolution in the means of international transport. So capital accumulation on a large scale took place because of the development of trade and industry at home and extended and repeated exploitation of several colonies and semi-colonies. Now this capital was concentrated in a few hands. So trusts and cartels emerged and banking capital merged with industrial capital. Now outlets had to be found for this capital to be invested abroad for the reasons I have just discussed, that there was a limit to making profit in the home countries. Now significant export of capital had been there even before the stage of predominance of finance capital, but from this period onwards we see that there was no looking back. By 1850, Britain's capital exports were around 30 million pounds a year, but from 1870 to 75 this jumped to 75 million pounds. So the income from this came to 50 million pounds, which was reinvested overseas. This financed the trade with the colonies, wherein huge quantities of raw materials were procured and vast quantities of industrial goods were sent out from British factories into these colonies like India. Now if we see the earlier trend, that is till the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the European traders imported bullion into India in return of the export of Indian cotton and silk goods, which had a flourishing market in the West. But the situation was reversed after the conquest of Bengal, when the company not only stopped importing bullion into India, again due to mercantilist policy, but also began to purchase goods from the surplus revenues of Bengal and the profits that they made from duty-free inland trade. So it was a situation of total win-win for England while a total loss making for India. Now this was the beginning of the plunder of Bengal, and by the end of 18th century the whole country kind of became a playground of plunder for colonial regime. So the period from 1757 to 1857, when the administration of the Indian subcontinent was in the hands of English East India Company, and from 1858 to 1947, when the country came to be directly ruled by the British Crown, during both these periods, the loot and plunder continued. However, the nature changed. India had to pay a very heavy price for these 200 years of colonial rule. The process of continuous plunder of India's raw materials, resources and wealth by Britain to enrich itself was going on at the cost of India's growing poverty, rising incidence of famine, spreading of disease, malnutrition, and all this led to the formulation of the theory of drain of wealth by the nationalist economists like Dadabhai Naoroji, M.G. Ranade, R.C. Dutt and several others. The economic exploitation of India at the hand of the colonial government was so massive that it left India with poverty amidst plenty. Now, talking about drain of wealth, the theory that was developed as a result of emergence of economic nationalism was done mainly with a view to analyze the main causes of poverty in India. The nationalists' definition of the drain was the idea of transfer of wealth and commodities from India to England without the former getting back any equivalent economic, material or commercial returns. So, drain in the Indian conception took the form of an excess of export over import, and this drain of wealth was referred to typically as a phenomenon of the colonial rule. Now, when we talk about the transfer of resources from India to England, either without getting anything in return or getting only a disproportionately small part of such a transfer of resources, largely came to be projected as drain of India's resources. So it was not only drain of wealth per se, but drain of India's resources also. And the most important contribution in this field was made by Dadabhai Naoroji in his famous work, The Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Dadabhai Naoroji made a very important attempt in this particular writing to outline the causes of the drain and also to measure the amount of the drain that was flowing from India to England, and also to trace the impact of such a process on Indian economy. He proved that the prevailing mass poverty in India was the direct result of these drain of resources from India to England. And he identified several forms of drain. So the first important form that he discussed was the remittance. Several remittances to England by Europeans for the support of their families or education of children, which was a very important feature of colonial system of government, because a large number of officers had been deputed to India while their families were staying abroad. Then there were remittances of savings by the employees of the company, since most these employees wanted to invest their wealth at home in England. Then there were remittances for purchase of British goods for the consumption of British employees, as well as purchase by them of British goods in India. Government purchase of several store manufacture in Britain, which again was boosting British economy rather than boosting Indian economy. Then there were also commitments that came to be described as home charges by Dadabhai Naoroji. There were interest charges on public debt that was held in Britain. In addition, the government of India had to make huge payments to people in England on account of several commercial connections, political and administrative services that had been established between India and England. So when we talk about home charges, this basically consists of several items like interest in public debt that was raised in England at very high interest rates. So that was another problem, that the very high interest rate had to be paid by India. Then there were annuities on account of railway and irrigation work. Then there were payments in connection with civil departments where Englishmen were employed. Then there were a series of home charges related to India office expenses, including pensions to retired officials who had worked in India or who worked for India in England and had retired there. So pensions to army, naval personnel, and several other allowances. All these also constituted home charges. In fact, Dadabhai Naoroji was the first to say that internal factors were not the reasons of poverty in India, because all along the colonial administrators had been blaming the socio-political factors related to India being the reasons behind India's underdevelopment and poverty. So Dadabhai Naoroji refuted that claim, and he made it a point to prove that this poverty was the direct result of colonial policies of draining wealth and prosperity out of India. Through his works in economics, Dadabhai Naoroji sought to prove that Britain was meticulously draining money out of India. He described 6 factors which resulted in external drain. Firstly, India was governed by a foreign government. Secondly, he pointed out that India did not invite immigrants, which bring labor and capital for economic growth. In fact, this had been enforced on India. Thirdly, he pointed out that India paid for Britain's civil administration and occupational army, which again was a completely wasteful expenditure. Then next he pointed out that India bore the burden of empire building both inside as well as outside its borders. So what gain India or Indians were getting out of these several military expeditions in which the colonial administrators were forcing Indians to join through their resources? While it is impossible to accurately measure the amount of drain which flowed from India into Great Britain during the colonial rule, some idea of however of the drain was conveyed by some of the figures that were quoted by some of these scholars. So Wells estimated that within a period of merely 5 years after Battle of Plassey, goods and bullion worth 4.94 million pounds sterling went out of the country, which was definitely a huge amount, and this was only an estimate for 5 years. According to William Digby, who was a British author, journalist and humanitarian, the total drain amounted to several million pounds up to the end of 19th century. And as per an estimate provided by Dadabhai Naoroji, around 200 to 300 million pound loss of revenue to Britain that was never returned can be accounted for. Another nationalist leader, journalist and a scholar who followed in the footsteps of Dadabhai Naoroji was R.C. Dutt, who also made the drain of wealth a major theme of his famous work on economic history of India. He discussed in detail the destruction of Indian traditional industries, handicrafts, which was termed as deindustrialization, and how it took India backwards by several years. If we talk about the effects of capitalism, then several changes had happened under colonial rule, which changed the position of both British economy as well as Indian economy. There was expansion of territorial possession of East India Company, which increased the involvement in tax collection, especially land revenue. And this had a very detrimental impact on the lives of peasants. British imposed political unity through their centralized rule, and slowly the concept of country and a nation also began to take shape. Several changes came about, like centralized uniform administration, common economic policies, similar institutions, laws, which led to this whole idea of one nation, and it also fostered the spirit of nationalism. So this political unity that was being brought about in India as a result of several of colonial policies had a contrary impact. A network of roads and railways had also greatly unified the country by linking one area to another and improving the means of communication and transportation. Another welcome change was the transmission of newspapers that brought about a transformation in socio-intellectual and political life of people. So they could now be in regular contact with each other. There was a change in the nomenclature of the subcontinent, and it came to be known as India under British rule. Thank you.